In this episode, I get to speak with Professor John Esposito. Professor Esposito is a leading scholar in Islamic studies, international affairs, and religion. He is also the founding director of Georgetown University's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. I've been a long-time admirer of Professor Esposito to the extent that I had my notes prepared for this interview, and in my mind, I had a proper structure outlined. But I think I was so starstruck that all my notes and plans went out the window, and the conversation was more free-flowing than I had anticipated. But I think credit goes to Professor Esposito's professionalism, that he kept it together, and I think the result, hopefully, you'll find really interesting. Let me know your thoughts, and please don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It really helps us. Thank you, and let's get started. John, welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. It's a bit surreal. I've been reading your books for a long time, back in 2010, when I was doing my master's as a mature student in London. Your books were so useful, and I had this picture drawn of John Esposito in my mind. So, you know what? For some reason, I thought Esposito is Spanish, so that's how little I know.
It's Italian, but it has a Spanish sound to it, and Spanish people sometimes think that that I am Spanish. But yeah.
So, John, tell us a little bit about. So, you, apart from being a professor, you also are actively involved in multi faith dialogue between Christians and Muslims. How did you get into the study of Islam, and then how did you get into the interfaith discussions?
Well, I in an early stage of my life, for about a 10-year period, from the age of 14 to 24, I was with the Capuchin Franciscans, and I wasn't ordained. At the end, I left, but I had spent 10 years there. Then I did a degree in Catholic theology, and I taught at a Catholic women's college. And I went to Temple University to get a PhD in Catholic studies. They had a new religion department, and you could do that. But I never did take the course. I became interested in world religions because there was a required course, and particularly in Hinduism and in Buddhism. And we hired a Muslim scholar, who was the last scholar to be hired, Ismail al-Furqi. And it was suggested that I take a course on Islam. And I declined politely because I wanted to finish my degree, and also because I had seen a movie called The Exodus, and had no idea that it was a distortion of history. But at the end of the day, I agreed to take one course. And I think what kept me in or pulled me in was that it wasn't just that Ismail was an incredible scholar and very dynamic teacher, but unlike most Americans at universities who might be looking at Islam, and Islam was pretty invisible in universities, my class was almost all Muslim students from the Muslim world. Faruqi would get scholarships every year. So to then be in, if you will, in a Muslim context, in a secular university, studying Islam and listening, not only what I read, but listening to how the students responded, that really, pulled me in. And so the next thing I knew, I was doing a PhD. And as my colleagues in Catholic theology said to me, "You'll never get a job." They were correct. I finished my degree, and there was only one job in the United States open. It was to teach world religions. And because I was trained in several religions, I got that job. But it wasn't to teach Islam. It was the Iranian Revolution that, in fact, gave me my career. I often say I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. But that was a reality, and it's an important reality to understand against the background of the West's encounter with Islam. For many in the West, and certainly in America, who knew nothing about Islam or Muslims, if there were Muslims living there, people were usually identified by their national background. They were Egyptian or Lebanese, and so to see every day crowds in the street shouting "Death to America," and then the taking of the hostages, etc. That created a context which did make Islam more significant in terms of being seen in media, but it was a kind of negative portrayal. But also, it offered opportunities from then on to be involved in government consulting, for example. You know, during the Carter administration and during subsequent administrations. So, in many ways, my career was, as I like to put it, spirit driven, because it wasn't something that I, in a calculated way, thought about. And I remember my mom saw me lecturing once. She hadn't seen me that often, and they said to her, "What does it feel like to see your son on stage?" And my mother said, "At least he has a job. He has a job." Just for the longest time, it was, he's got a PhD, but it's a very tenuous situation. And then the opportunities came, particularly with 9/11 and others, to do the kind of publishing that I was able to do. But initially, I sent out 50 book proposals. 47 did not answer. 3 said, "Great idea, no market." And then, as soon as the Iranian Revolution occurred, that opened up the career.
That's really interesting. So you were like a government advisor in the time of Carter. Is that around the time when we had the hostage crisis in
Yes.
Iran? So that must have been
Yes.
really interesting time.
It was. I mean, in fact, Fazlur Rahman, a very famous scholar, Muslim scholar in Chicago, myself and 2 other younger scholars were invited to meet at one point, invited by the Secretary of State to go to a meeting with people from the state as well as the National Security Council, and really to talk about the background to understanding what was going on. And it was enlightening in the sense that, again, uh, most diplomats, when they were trained, it wasn't until around the middle 1980s when the Foreign Service Institute started having courses on Islam in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I was involved with the Foreign Service officer who did that. So in this conversation, you had a sense of people, many of whom really did not have a grasp of um, uh, Islam in the broader sense of the Muslim world, of even Iran. You know, there was a very famous scholar and a good friend of mine named Jim Bill, and he did his PhD at Princeton, and is expert in Iran on Iran. But Jim said to me that it was only when he went to Iran to do his doctoral dissertation that he realized how alive Islam was as a religion, as opposed to just studying it from the 8th or the 10th century. You see, so that's why you could have this issue. I remember in one of the sessions I had mentioned a prominent Iranian, uh, uh, and um, and one of the officials said, "We need to meet him," and you're not answering the question. I keep asking you, and you don't answer it. I said, "Okay." He said, "So where can we meet him?" I said, "Well, actually, he's in a cemetery. He's been dead for 8 years." I mean, it was so it was. And an interesting thing that really played out was that in our conversation, this was the time when the parliament said that if America repented, it would release the hostages. And so one of the points that Fazlur Rahman made, and I made, etc., was this is not the Christian notion of repentance. In Islam, it's different. You depart from the straight path, you get back on the straight path, you do the right thing. That night, Jimmy Carter said, if they think I'm going to get down on my knees and confess my right, and the parliament then came back and raised the context of which they expected an apology.
That's very interesting. So how was your advice received? Do you think, did it have any effect in some capacity, or was it a complete kind of um, no
I think there was an influence. I think there was an influence in the consulting when I look back, because, for example, I and my colleague John Vole, among others, were involved in advising during Republican administrations, And I remember one time I asked the officer, who was in charge. I said, I don't understand. This is a Republican administration. Why am I being involved? Clearly, my idea on policy is different, etc. And he said, I said, and why am I being invited this often? And he said, because you can say what you say, we can write it up and send it up. If we say it,
Very true.
we could have a job situation. We would have a problem with our job. So as a result, there was a lot of government consulting, and then in mid years later, doing a lot of the training for foreign service officers, also then made that kind of connection.
Very interesting. John, you're expert in Islam. You're a prolific writer. I'm so impressed always, like how many books you've written and how many publications. How many publications do you actually have?
I have about 55 books that were published, a single author, joint author, etc., and probably more than 100 articles. I stopped writing articles a long time ago. It's very, very rare. And then my work has been translated at different times into about 50 languages or so.
Yeah, because I remember when I was in university, it was like really highly regarded by all the academic staff, the professors, lecturers, everyone loved your books.
But I was very lucky. I mean, um, again, to get back to my mother, they said to my mother, was John a voracious reader? And my mother said, all my sons had to read. She would, especially in the summertime, she would. And they said, well, what was John like? And she said, well, John was the only one of my sons that needed lots of pictures in the books. So I wasn't exactly an avid reader
Wow.
as a young person. No.
Wow. When I used to read your books, I always thought like academics kind of tend to write things in a way that it you can kind of feel that they're not kind of engaging sometimes with the subject so much. Is kind of like more completely at from a distance objective. But your books extremely good for referencing and everything, but I could just feel that you had that extra um, knowledge. And at that time, I had no idea that you did this interfaith work as well. So it really came through in the writing. Did any of your writings get you in trouble because it was difficult times at politically?
Well, it depended. I mean, over the years, things have quieted down a bit, but certainly when 9/11 occurred, I was in the top list that the Campus Watch had, and even today on different lists, my name was there. Back though, around that time and after, there were a lot of nasty emails, sometimes threats, physical threats. I mean, that is through email.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah, or a picture. And once I got a picture of, it was like a Western with a cowboy with a hat on and a rifle, and he was shooting at a picture of me.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a quiet. So I mean, there were quite a few years when one had to live with that. Um,
Yeah, I had noticed.
Now it's more sometimes in writing. For example, people like Daniel Pipes,
Yes.
and others. Daniel still loves every now and then to publish an article or two on me, which will. He did an article, I think, last year. He didn't do it; his outfit did it. Something like, John Esposito and his terrorist friends. These
Really?
subtle little types.
I've never
That's
read
right.
that. I'm
Yeah.
gonna go and read it. So, um, back around 2010, when I was at university, um, main discussions at that time were about like Clash of Civilization, Samuel Huntington, things like that. Is that still where we are now, or have things, the discussion, the debate moved on? What's the main kind of in academia? What's the main
I
thing?
think not so much I would say that um, I knew Sam. We were invited to debate in Saudi Arabia, and we were in other contexts. And especially, when he did his book, he moved from just saying Islam has bloody borders rather than some Muslim countries have bloody, to saying, and Islam has bloody innards. Okay, um, that kind of mentality in Bernard Lewis's, writing, um, that mentality has continued to exist. It's not that people are necessarily now even quoting the person, but the idea is there that there's this clash of civilizations. For example, if you look now, look at a couple of the people that have been appointed by Trump or are going to be appointed by Trump, and you will see, at least two that I'm aware of, who basically say things in effect that this is a clash between. One of them said between Christian history and Christian faith and the Muslim world and Islam. I mean, there's so that notion of not dealing specifically with what are the specific causes of what's happening is still there. And I think certainly I would say that too often Islam and Muslims um, are still looked down upon by a significant segment. And this is a problem in the Trump administration. You look at the new ambassador to Israel, who's a former governor of Arkansas, but he's also a born again Christian, an ordained minister, if I have it right. And you look at his statements that he's made with regard to Israel and Palestine. And at times over the years, he said things like there are no Palestinians. There is no Palestine. There is no, etc. And the right, the Christian right, has a very strong, following. And I also think among the far right, from the UK to other European countries, there is a sense of, and you see it from the far right, that they will actually make statements that are really about Islam and Muslims. So accusing, for example, saying that the mayor of London is somehow an extremist or a terrorist, or this is and Baroness Worsley's recent book, Muslims Don't Matter, is reflecting this issue.
It's very true. Because in my mind, I was thinking maybe because some of these things go hand in hand with politics and geopolitics. At that time, we had September 11th, so there was that war on terrorism going on. So I was thinking, how much is the clash of civilization tied with that? And now, since then, because there's regional kind of conflicts, Iran and other things. So maybe I thought it might be that they're trying to shift the discussion from a civilizational clash to kind of portraying certain countries, certain leaders, or certain people as the bad guys, so that is kind of easier divide and conquer kind of thing. Or do you think that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I mean, for example, if you take Netanyahu, okay, Netanyahu is guilty of genocide, all right? But I don't believe that Netanyahu that his primary driver is religion. Now he will use religion, and he has a number of people in his cabinet. I don't believe that that's true for Netanyahu. Historically, if you look at him, it's about his notion of Zionism, etc. And I think too often the religion gets drawn into it. And I think there is a religious dimension. The ultra right in Israel is a problem. The Christian right, for example, and its uncritical support for not just support for the country of Israel, but for Israel and non-recognition of Palestine and Palestinian rights. All of that does then bring dimension in, but I think the drivers are really political.
True. And I wasn't expecting this discussion to go into geopolitics, and we'll kind of get back to the interfaith dialogue and interaction between Islam and America. But what do you think when you see what's going on in Palestine? I mean, I remember I used to think the issues in Kashmir and Palestine are so difficult to sort out that it's going to be the last things to be sorted out before the Day of Judgment or something. And even then,
Yeah,
probably it'll be Kashmir and then it'll be Palestine at the very end. But now,
yeah.
I mean, at this moment in time when we actually, it's like the darkest moment in time. But in that, I still see a hope coming out of all of this, that maybe this is what we needed to ultimately come to some kind of a settlement. What do you think?
I, I'm, I'm very worried about the whole issue of a settlement, at least in the near future. The Look, the Biden administration, Joe Biden was a great president domestically, and also with some of what he did in terms of our international relations. On the other hand, has been deeply and continues to be connected with what is genocide in Palestine. Um, the situation in Israel has become, from what I see, and from even studies, etc., that come out, the situation has become even more radicalized and far right. Um, so I don't see anything coming soon. The fact that Netanyahu would be willing to engage in a war in Lebanon and to then kill thousands more of civilians and know it, um, and if given the provocation, might do something with Iran. And we are getting some European countries that are beginning to back away from an uncritical support, but there's still too much of a support. And it's now affecting education. And I've seen it in issues in the UK, but also in the United States and other places where universities and university administrations are actually at times restricting the ability to deal with Palestine, whether it's in class or with, uh, and on the other hand, the term anti-Semitism being used in the broadest possible way, not in terms of anti Semitism as it should be understood and rejected, but the idea that to be critical of Israel, to, etc., that is being anti Semitic, that free, and again, universities, many of them, or at least some of them prominent universities, are imposing a variety of restrictions. Whether it's Columbia University, but you can go all the way across the United States, and we're also see it in Europe. So I'd be very worried. And with the swing to the far right, even though it's a political swing in Europe, it's also an incredible growth of Islamophobia. Has accompanied that, and now with a Trump administration, where Trump has said, you know, uh, when he was running for office, that he wants to again, have a Muslim ban, and he's appointed somebody who, he's got a number of people, but who actually even uh, cast the conflict in Christian world versus Muslim world, and these are a senior cabinet position. The fellow who's going to be, if I remember correctly now, the fellow who's going to be Secretary of Defense, who has no qualification to be Secretary of Defense, let alone talking in terms of warfare and the language that's used, which tends to frame it, in a way which I worry that we won't see a resolution soon. I've spent most of my life believing that right around the corner was going to be a resolution, you know, uh, and it's far from here.
Yeah. Um, I was wondering, just listening to what you were saying, um, is we'll talk about the um encounter between Islam and America, within America, but even globally, where things stand, historic kind of how we got to where we are. Um, but listening to what you're saying, it also reminds me in America, there's just so many splits. It's not just between splits between Americans, non-Muslim Americans, and Muslim Americans, but Democrats and Republicans. And it's just getting worse and worse, where both sides think the other side is not just a difference of opinion, but they're like traitors and they're non-Americans and these splits are not just in America, but generally a lot of countries you see similar things. What you saw happened in Egypt when Morsi came, and how when he was removed, how there was a brutal crackdown and the people just ate it all up. They didn't really mind. And then what's going on in Iran between the religious side and non-religious side, in Turkey, Europe. So do you think things are getting, generally, divisions are getting worse and worse, and why is that?
Well, I think oh geez, there are a lot of factors. I certainly think there's the issue of leadership. There's the issue of the fact that um, we've had Islamophobia existing for several decades. Only it's become more and more prominent. You know, I in the one edition of my book, Islamic Threat, which would have then been probably maybe uh, the late 1990s, I began to talk about Clash of Civilizations, but also talk about and quote British media and other media, etc. So we've got a long thing where that Islamophobia, has been there, and a long thing in the last 10 years of a growth of the far right across and in countries we'd never expected, in France, in Austria, and in governments. So it's not just that there are movements, it's that it's affecting government. France has been under Macron, one expected it to be not Islam not be seen as a major problem or major focus, but the discrimination that's occurred there, the discrimination that's occurred in Germany, the discrimination that's occurred in the Netherlands. Um, so that's I think that's the issue, and then the impact in terms of government. The fact that governments do have either leaders or members of their parliaments who are, in addition to the political drive, they also associate it with a religious dimension. You know, so that's a big concern. And one of the ironies is that in a country like the UK or the United States, Muslims have had problems, but also a sector of Muslim society has actually become part of, if you will, uh, the society and its establishment in terms of elective office or positions in society, and yet you still have, when you combine it with the far right, the dangers that we see, and uh, I just think, I mean, you pick up. I look at newspapers all the time, and etc. And you don't see a rainbow of hope. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Uh, and I think that's something that we have to be very concerned about.
True. I think the Islamophobia in Europe goes back a long, long way. Um, Tell me if I'm wrong, but like this, um, Islam is one of the only outside forces that ever got close to taking over, invading Europe in the past, whether it was from Spain or Italy or um, also just the whole Christian Islam kind of back and forth religious wars. I think there's a lot of like subconscious kind of bias. I read somewhere that I don't know if this is right, but I read somewhere that when we eat cutlery and we use knife and fork, the fork was invented by the Turks. And for a long time, Europeans never used the fork because it was made by the Muslims. And actually, that's why the devil is always holding a fork.
Look, that's interesting.
So there's a lot of these kind of underlying subconscious kind of biases that people don't even realize why I have a phobia against these people, but it's ingrained. But initially, I used to think maybe that's what's been transferred over to America as well. Do you think that's the case, or do you think America is like a separate case from Europe?
No, I think that the understanding of history, um, and the study of history for a long time, um, either excluded Islam or treated Islam only in terms of holy wars. You know what I mean? And framed it that way in terms of the history. And so that was what people were. you know, were raised with. They either had no knowledge of Islam as a religion, but more of Islam as a threat to the West. And in many ways, Huntington's clash, although he was talking about, as it were, today in the 1990s, okay, was connected, to the past, and I think that it just gets reinforced today. When things happen, people will use the word Muslim when in fact they should be saying Saudis or
Yes.
Qataris, or you know what I mean? That kind of idea. And I think that also it's also your, if you will, your religious right, both among Christians and Muslims and their preachers, that wind up reinforcing this.
John, I've listened to your talks, how you have um, all over the world uh, taken opportunity to kind of help people understand the Muslim point of view. Um, and it's very much appreciated. Today, what I wanted to do is I've got some questions for you where I'm going to be the devil's advocate, because these are general questions that come across so much in Europe, because Europe has a bigger population of Muslims than in America. But maybe these
Mm.
questions are also there in America as well. So I'm going to present some of these questions to you, and you tell me um, how much factual they are, how much actual reason for concern there is, and how much is it's overstated. So the first thing is we're always told that Muslims they cannot integrate. They have such a strong loyalty to their religion that Islam comes first and their nationality comes second. So they're always going to have their first loyalty with Islam, and they cannot integrate and become part of our society. Is this something you hear in America as well? And what's your answer?
Well, I think that's an image, but where you're going to see it, it's already here. You'll see it emerging even during the Trump period. The fact is that you now have, well, when I was raised, okay, Catholicism came first, country came second, in terms of your personal life and political. And there's still a struggle at times. We see it when, in fact, you have some bishops who will say that that their followers should not vote for a candidate because of the candidate's position on X or Y. Okay. Um, but I think that what complicates it now is you have, uh, when you have a Christian right and a certain kind of Christian right, if for the Christian right, America is a Christian nation, and for a certain kind of right, even in Europe, even in countries where people are no longer practicing their Christianity, they interpret their history in terms of a sense of conflict, between Muslims and their attitude towards Islam, or their openness to politicians, who not only make Islam a international issue but a domestic issue. You know, it's they get away with that because that's still very much part. So what's interesting here is that the subtle difference is realizing that although this may be, for example, these movements may be really concerned about uh, either political issues or also just the idea of white society is going to disappear and be replaced. Especially you take countries, for example, in Northern Europe that I admire in many ways, Sweden, Norway, etc. For many people there in Denmark, they have a whole history of one language, and one people, as it were, historically. And so even where people have moved away from their faith, their attitude when it comes to culture and even citizenship, you know, uh, and the threat that the other will multiply more. There have been articles written even in the 1990s. Pat Buchanan wrote a piece and said, while how did it go? While Turkish doctors, you know, in Germany are performing abortions, as it were, on indigenous Okay, these Turkish doctors had their prospering families of 6 children, or it's etc. So I think that's where the religion card comes into play, and what's compounded it is that it's no longer. It now does have a strong religious dimension with these religious nationalists, these Christian nationalists. Yeah, you have a member of the Senate, for example, who, when he was running for office just recently, and he's been educated at Stanford. I think he may have gone to Harvard Law School, and basically said he's a Christian nationalist, and America is a Christian country. And people like Trump and the kinds of people they have will play into that. If you go back and look at the Trump administration, if people who see this go to bridge.georgetown.edu, okay, bridge.georgetown.edu, you will see we did a whole set in the past during the first Trump administration on members of his government, of his close office, Secretary of State, etc., who's very strongly Christian right. And if you saw his interviews at times in Israel, particularly, he'd be on a religious program, and the kind of position he took, that leads to something. So I think that's what we're really up against.
Very true. What about when we're told that Islam is inherently a violent religion, and we're also told not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I often say to people, well, I mean, I don't write this way in public, but I'll say it here. When people go on about it, I'll say, really, if you look at the body count of the numbers of people that were killed historically, by Christians, it's going to outweigh whatever you think the body count is in the reverse. I think that, again, what we forget historically is how often rulers used religion, caliphs used religion to legitimate their warfare, and whether it was Sunni vis-a-vis Shia at times, or, if you will, spreading their caliphate geographically. And one has to distinguish between when was this a political driver versus another thing. We had an incident recently where one of the things that amazed me is, if you look at Northern Europe, and you don't have a lot of Muslims there. I mean, you have Muslims there, but not a lot. And yet you have a strong Muslim issue. And a progressive country that you would expect, like Sweden, has people burning Qurans, okay? You have an issue in Denmark, and we actually have a page on a prominent person there who bills himself as a scholar of Islam. Government often goes to him, etc. And his interpretation is very much an interpretation that says, to be objective about Islam, you have to be a non-Muslim Islam. See, a Muslim, even if they're great scholars, can't be objective, and so it's got to be. But then I'm the exception. That is, it's me, and says, and Esposito, he has a whole paragraph, is also a problem because, and note what he says. He says, well, Esposito's analysis of jihad tends to emphasize jihad as striving and struggling in life, the broader notion, and it downplays the fact, and then he winds up saying that, in fact, the history of Islam is one of violent jihad down through the centuries, as it were. So that's.
I actually heard, I think you've been called like a closet Muslim before.
Yes. There have been rumors for years.
Probably from both sides.
I would visit countries, and I remember in Saudi Arabia, I was checking into a hotel, and somebody came up to me and said, "Mashallah, mashallah." I said, "I think I know what you're going to say." And then I was at Oxford at a luncheon, and after it, a professor who is a Muslim, we were walking, and he said, "John, I don't know if you know it, but there's a rumor coming out of Canada." I said, "That rumor's been out there for many years, that I and Anne-Marie Schimmel had come out of the closet, as it were."
I was going to ask you, did you know Anne-Marie Schimmel? Did you ever meet her?
Yes, I knew her. I got to know her quite well. She was a remarkable woman, and remarkable scholar.
Yeah. I heard, like, I was speaking to one of my lecturers, a German lady who was teaching in London, and she had attended some lectures from Anne-Marie Schimmel, and she was saying basically Anne-Marie Schimmel was sitting in a chair and she kind of had her eyes closed and she was kind of almost like in a trance, and she delivered
That's
the
what she
whole
would do.
lecture.
She has, I think she had, the ability to actually see, see, I had to give a lecture at a place. So she's on the stage, and halfway through the lecture, she turns around and she's got her back to the stage, and she didn't even realize it. And everybody was looking at me, and she continued to lecture. But I think she had a photographic memory too. But her language skills were incredible. Her productivity was enormous.
Yeah. You were talking about how um, European countries who actually have very little Muslim population are some of the most fearful. Even in the UK, I noticed that like the places where there's actually no Muslims are the ones who are most terrified of Muslims, and the places where there's Muslim populations, people get along absolutely fine, and actually they like the whole diversity. And I think that's kind of touches upon what you have said in the past, how in America the younger generations who interact with Muslims in schools, colleges, universities, get along much better than their parents and elder generations who didn't have that interaction.
Absolutely. And I could see that in my career. That is, when I moved, I was at Holy Cross for about 20 years, and then I moved to Georgetown. It was for been 30, 31 years. But I could see it comparing my early years at Georgetown when I was teaching and later. That is, it was not uncommon for me to be able to say to the class, how many of you have taken a course on the Middle East in high school? Or how many of you have been exposed to Islam in one way or another in school? Our educational system had changed, and the point that you made that was really good was when you, because it seems ironic. Gee, if you don't have any Muslims here, then what are you afraid of? That's the whole point. You don't know them as neighbors, you don't know them as families, and so you see it out there, and you see the rhetoric in media, and particularly in social media, and what's going to happen is you're going to think that's the way they always are. I mean, there have been many studies on TV media and print media, for example, that basically show an absolute disproportion of coverage. And I remember I did a program with media people on stage. One was the editor of a major newspaper, and the other was a reporter, etc. And a Muslim got up and said, "Why is it that you only cover the extremist side? You don't deal with..." And I was really surprised, because the person that said this was somebody with a PhD who's since gone on to publish some really great books. But he said, when it bleeds, it leads, and that's he said, "I'm sorry to say that, but that's what news is.
Yeah,
That's what will catch the more provocative, that the situation is." And I think that that's what we clearly continue to run
yeah.
into.
Why is it that so? You said how in America people didn't really have much knowledge or interest in Islam or Muslims until the Iranian Revolution. Why is that, given that Muslims have had presence in America for a long, long time? Whether that was through, I've even heard that like some of the crew people in Christopher Columbus's ship were Muslims from Spain. But there's also the slaves. I think 10-20% of the slave population were Muslims. I think maybe some of them had to hide their religion and even let go of their religion over time, but it was there. And then there was interactions between America and Morocco and Tunisia, Algeria, started very early on. So why is it that people had no understanding about Islam?
Well, first of all, I mean, the the situation with regard to slaves and how many were Muslims, etc. That wasn't the studies on that, and knowledge that now was just not there. Okay. Now I was raised in Brooklyn, New York. New York City's a major, and I grew up in different places. Okay, and the fact is that there was never any exposure to Islam and Muslims, and if you did have it, you might be dealing with somebody and just say to yourself, well, they're from the Middle East. You know what I mean? In other words, they're Middle Eastern. but not the religious dimension. And the religious dimension, if you did get any, would be the kind of thing that would come from, let's say, from media, in whether it's a film like The Exodus or it's a film on medieval, history. So in many ways, although we had Muslims, they were invisible. We had a considerable number of also Arab Christians. Okay, but it, the invisibility. I remember speaking to I think it was the Foreign Relations Committee in Australia, and the chair of it came from Greece originally, and she said that she came over as a young woman, and she said, until you wound up with Iran and then 9/11, she said people were known as Greek, Egyptian, Lebanese. The religion thing didn't come in, and but then when it does come in, given historic events and the way media also portray them, and especially social media, when you look at some of the studies that have been done, for example, in the U.S., and you can see at times hundreds of millions of dollars going to these anti-Muslim websites, and this has been going on for, like, a couple of decades, where this, and most people weren't really aware of what was happening, and I think that's, again, that's part of the issue, or the problem.
Yeah. Do you think there's some neglect on the side of Muslims that they didn't understand this properly and counter it good enough from an early time? The propaganda, the print media, now there's a lot going on in social media. But do you think Muslims kind of weren't as engaged from a PR point of view as they should have been?
I think in the early period, Muslims, many of them were like immigrants from other countries. They came here, and their concern was survival, getting a job, living in neighborhoods, and there was a tendency, often, for Muslims, when they could, to live in the same neighborhood, and of course to go to the mosque, but not to be dealing with other faiths, Now that changed, but I remember when I first got my job at Holy Cross, I was invited to a interfaith dialogue. So there was the rabbi, and he was going to talk about Judaism. There was a priest, Catholicism, and I said, "Well, what do I do?" And he said, "Well, you do Islam." I said, "I'm not a Muslim," and I was thinking, people would be offended. And I said, "Well, this was in Cambridge, Mass." They said, "Well, we have one or two people, in Cambridge, but they tend to be, engineers or scientists, and they didn't feel that they would be up to that kind of conversation." Now that changed over time. For years, you didn't have Muslim scholars that were visible, except for a few, Fazlur Rahman, Said Hussein, and Faruqi. But that took years, and that had to do with also a generation that would come along and would want to major in Islam as a career, right? Because in many Muslim families, you know, um, and I've had this situation with their parents where I remember once speaking at UCLA and to students, and I said, "Well, a Muslim mother and father will say, if you say you want to do Islamic studies, they'll say, well, go to medical school and we'll get the imam to teach you." These two guys were laughing, and I said, "Why are you laughing?" They said, "That's exactly what our experience was when we told our mom." So it took quite a few years, and then about 10 years ago, maybe no longer than that, maybe 15 years ago, we did a search, and all of our candidates were Muslim, which I couldn't believe. Okay, and Jonathan Brown was the person that, excuse me, that wound up getting the position. So there was the invisibility. You come here, an immigrant, so you go to mosque the way Catholics would be going to the church, and that's where you had trying to fit in, raise a family, and hold on to your faith.
Yeah,
It takes a while to get to a point where one can move and be in a position to move out.
true. I was thinking earlier, mentally, when I was preparing for this talk, is that I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding between communities. Tell me if I'm wrong, if this is just my anecdotal experience or if this is an observable fact. But basically, I was thinking Muslims tend to get offended by different things to what a Christian would get offended, or to what a Jewish person would get offended. Like non-Muslims are often surprised why Muslims get so wound up when there's like a cartoon about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or when something's written about the Quran. Um,
Mm.
but on the other hand, when it's a personal attack on a Muslim, they don't really make such a big fuss because they just see that as part of the trial from God, and it's pay it, it because this is like a insult that came as an the fact that they're a Muslim. It's kind of it's a trial from God, and they'll get rewarded for it. Whereas um, Jews, Muslims are often thinking, why don't Jews and Christians get offended when similar things are said about Moses or Jesus? And it's because they all come from different points of views and different priorities and different maybe scriptural and historical development. But I think that that mismatch as well, and part of that is maybe why Muslims didn't really engage in PR as much as maybe some other religion would do.
Yeah, I think that there are sensitivities. We know this even if we put religion aside. There are cultural differences in cultures, and so in one culture, what can be said or done can be offensive to the other. Okay, and I remember at a certain point, a number of years ago now, there was a movie that got a lot of attention uh, on, in a sense, the life of Christ, and it was in the movie theaters, etc. And I had a colleague, uh, and she told her students they should go and see it. See, given the way I was raised, my reaction was they should be demonstrating against it. When I was a kid, there would have been a demonstration. This would have been seen as, and I think that um, for for Muslims, um, the, you know, mosque going Muslims, etc. Um, there's this difference in that would exist. I this is not completely germane, but it is. The Muslims that come from the Muslim world to study at Temple were required to study another religion, and they could also study Islam. In fact, at Temple, you had to do one religion major, two minor. Okay, so one of my colleagues, Muslim, goes to his good friend and classmate who's a Christian to the house, and he raises a question, and he's all excited because he's studying Christianity. And he raises a question with regard to the Bible, and he says, "Well, if you bring me a Bible, I can, And the family's looking around like they have a Bible, but they're not sure where they put it, right? Which is, and and it's a big difference there, and so I think that it's and also the the more you become involved, it seems to me, in interfaith situations, not even talking about getting together and discussing other faiths, but where you're in a pluralistic context, then the more sensitivity you will have to the other. You won't, you know, I mean, even when I talk to people, not all the time, but at times I try to say to them to get a sense of the the piety of of a Muslim. I'll talk about the fact that when a Muslim goes to drive the car, or when a Muslim goes to do X or Y, they will be saying Bismillah, etc. Um, Now, I was raised as a kid when I would write to put a cross and to put JMJ, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, at the top of a piece of paper. Well, I don't think most Catholic kids that are educated today are doing that. Okay, but many Muslims will be putting Bismillah, at the top of something. So I think it's also that it's a religio-cultural kind of sense of difference, and then the stereotypes of Muslims. I mean, for some people, it'll almost have the idea that, oh well, Muslims can have four wives. Well, maybe if you're the ruler of a major country, political as well as religious reasons, but it's those, seeing those kinds of differences. Now we've come though a tremendous way. I mean, the extent to which uh, interfaith groups and organizations. I've traveled all over the United States, for example, very, very often. And the extent to which in many towns and cities you have vibrant groups where Muslims, Christians, and Jews can sit together. But there still can be, um, you know, there still can be differences.
Yes, I think you're very right. Like at work, I had a friend who was studying Christian theology. He was doing a PhD. And we used to get on really well because we kind of understood each other better than anyone else probably could have understood who doesn't understand religion that well. So,
Yeah.
so that was quite interesting. When you're studying Islam, how do you separate in your mind what's culture and what's religion, or what's Islam and what's Muslim?
Yeah. Well, the way I think did it historically, that is in my life, were the diversity of experiences. In other words, so it was the experience. So, I mean, for example, um, if you go to Pakistan, as I did early in my career, and you see the way a wedding is conducted, okay, and the separation of men and women, et cetera, okay, and then you're in another country where the wedding is very religious, et cetera, but in fact there's no separation, then you suddenly get rid of the idea that the first is a dogmatic, you know, and rather there's a cultural dimension to it. And I think in a lot of things that was the case. The difference between um, um, dealing with the Middle East and then going to Southeast Asia, and then you could see both the strong faith, but also the diversity of practices and even opinions, um, uh, and to the extent that you could see that for one, the it was the influence of their Arab culture. For the other, it was the influence of their Indonesian culture, that then shaped, uh, their some of their religious activities, attitudes, but it's not something you get, at least back then, in a book. I mean, one of the things that people don't understand is how few books were out there and around, relatively speaking. It was
Yeah,
conceivable when I would do work and you get books from the library. Now you put a topic up there and you want to not do it. You don't want to write because you see all these books you could possibly be looking at.
yeah,
You know, and I think the same thing is true with the whole question of experience. For me, when I first went to Malaysia, it was a different. I could see the strong Muslim dimension, but there was a difference in the way it played out in some areas.
very true. Because my wife is a convert to Islam. My sister-in-law is a convert. They've been Muslims for many years, but even they sometimes find it difficult to understand like what's religion and what's culture. That's kind of the thing that we're talking about as well at home. It also reminds me of a little story with my mum. When I was at university, my friend from university called. She was from Saudi Arabia, so she called home. We used to have a landline back in those days. My mum picked up and she said "Assalamu alaikum," and then my mum immediately started speaking Urdu with her. And she doesn't know Urdu because she's from Saudi Arabia. And my mum said she's so rude, she won't speak to me in Urdu. And I was saying, Mom, she's not from Pakistan. And she said, well, she just said, Assalamu alaikum. And I said, okay, Mom. So I was also wondering, because you've studied Islam for a long, long time, did you have any moments where, um, you, for some aspects or topics, where you had like a light bulb moment where you started looking at things differently, whether to do with Muslims or politics or Islam as a religion?
Well, I think that for me, my 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 understanding as a person understanding, um, and as a scholar, but as a person understanding, it's very conditioned by not just what I would read, but by what I would encounter, you know? And so uh, the way in which I could understand the faith and the influence or the power, if you will, of Islam in people's lives would be that the people that I was with and who came from all kinds of different careers. It wasn't, sitting around with imams, that's really a very small kind of, but it was, um, you know, uh, for example, years ago, um, knowing a remarkable Malaysian woman, a professor, and the kind of person that she was, and uh, her faith. It wasn't that I had to see her praying. You know what I mean? It was that kind of and having a lot of the the sort of personal experiences gives you a sense of not only of the kind of faith when you're studying it intellectually, but the diversity that can be there, both bad and good in terms of you know uh, some people's interpretation, you know, of Islam is like for me, some people's interpretation of Catholicism, where I want to say, well, I don't think you got it right on this one. So it's really getting that kind of to see the diversity and to see the way it played out in in uh, in life in terms of their worldview, and how they dealt with other people and how they and it wasn't that they were saying things that were pious, but it was that there was a level of concern, a level of integrity, and one of the things that always has impressed me um, is prayer 5 times a day. And see, when I was a Franciscan in a monastery, we prayed multiple times a day, throughout the day, morning to night, and seeing that in in so many contexts really made an impression on me.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. What I was also thinking, you've been to, I think you've been involved in Iran quite a bit. As I understand it, you also had the opportunity to meet Khomeini's daughter. Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
That must have been quite an experience. I'm
It,
wondering, do you, in your professional academic career, do you have more often, do you kind of, have you had the chance to study Sunni Islam or Shia Islam, or do you have
oh,
specialism in any particular
Sunni
area?
Islam, Sunni Islam. In fact, what I would say is that when the Iranian Revolution occurred, and people who were, let's say, experts on the Middle East, um, most of them, uh, you know, I used to kiddingly say that it was a time when answering machines came. And so the good thing about that was if the New York Times called you and asked you about something in Shia Islam, they'd be able to not they'd leave a message. Then they could run and try to figure out how they were going to answer that, because the education system could very often be overwhelming emphasis on understanding Islam in terms of Sunni Islam. Um, and it was even as I think I mentioned earlier in the interview. This colleague of mine, Jim Bill, who was an Iran expert, said that he really didn't have an understanding of Islam as as such an alive religion until he went to Iran. I mean, in terms of Iran, that because all he looked at was history of Iran and then Islam within that history of Islam, and not very much at all on the modern or contemporary side of things. So my knowledge of Shia Islam really grew enormously uh, with the Iranian Revolution, and my having to really, really drill deep in terms of understanding, people, etc. Yeah.
Um, I'm also curious to know, from the many years of studying and experience that you've had, are there any particular things that have kind of irked you about the Muslim attitude, or also are there any things that you kind of troubled you with the Islamic theology, what's in the Quran, Hadith, anything like that?
Uh, the, with regard to the Quran, um, not not really, but it did take a while. But one of the things that we had to do when I was a student was actually to not just read the entire Quran, but to basically set it up in terms of themes that occurred, etc. And so um, it took a while to work through and then to understand and be able to then respond to people who will only take a passage from the Quran and not put it in a context and not put it in even the broader context of the Quran. You know, now see, we do that depending on who we are. We'll do that with our own religion if we're educated with it. Somebody says, "Well, Jesus said this," and you want to say, "Yeah, but Jesus also said this, this, and this." And now, when it comes to the Hadith, I'm not a scholar of Hadith. I mean, I look at it, I work on it, but um, I'm not somebody that can really uh, that drills deep in. I have to, if I have a concern, then I have to either look stuff up or talk to a colleague who is more of a an expert. I think that the thing um, that one also notices is um, the tension at times um, within uh, within the Islamic world, or among Muslims, that you see in other faiths, which is that you have some people who are more, in the best sense of the term, uh, progressive and diverse in their attitude. You know, um, uh, uh, well, I can give you a tough example. Okay,
Yeah.
um, you know, um, in my lifetime, when I was raised Catholic, okay, and for most people raised Catholic, there was a mentality that the Catholic Church was the one true church of all the Christians, right, and the one true religion. Okay, now then the question becomes, where does dialogue and diversity occur in that context?
Yeah.
It can occur, but always, if you're not careful, there's always a kind of looking down in terms of the other. And I would see that in Islam. That is, and I'd see it among Muslim communities. It would depend on. I remember sitting at a wedding. I won't get too specific, so that people won't be able to figure this one out. But my wife and I were the only non-Muslims there, and we had to travel quite a distance to go. And I was sitting at a table with a fella, and whose father had founded a Shia community. When they came, and so we were talking, and he said, "But now I have a problem." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He said, "My two sons came to me, and they were like, I think, in their early to mid-20s, and they said, we can't continue to go to that mosque. That imam's khutbah, we just can't deal with his worldview." And the father said, "I agree with them." And he said, "What I know now is I'm going to have to go to another mosque, or we have to establish another one, because it's not the mosque that my father set up, and the imam is not, um, and so that's the thing where you just realize when you first see it, you might, in a way, kind of misunderstand in the sense of not getting comparative about your own faith and what your attitude was, or just that for many people who are very conservative in their faith, it can be that way. I remember giving a talk someplace, and a woman drove me from one place to the other, and she said, and I was talking about, I guess I must have been we were talking about pluralism, and she said, my father's a Baptist preacher, and he's very conservative, and she said, I told my father, I said, um, she said, I shared a joke with him, the Baptist dies, goes to the pearly gates, St. Peter's is there, and then he looks down the road and he says to St. Peter, there's another house down there. It's kind of much smaller. I'm like, who's there? And St. Peter says, the Baptists. And so it's her way of saying to her father, don't think you're the only faith, and that's the only person that's going to get into heaven. So that kind of challenge, for I think, and for many believers, in terms of dealing with the question of diversity. But what I do like in recent years, and not that this is just a personal experience. I've known a number of people that have written little tracts on the notion of mercy and the prophet, and the notion of and that brings out a dimension more for others that are that are reading. I mean, I think the reason I stayed in graduate school studying Islam, and I didn't realize it fully until recently, I don't know why, was that I discovered that there was a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, not just a Judeo-Christian tradition. And of course, with this stuff that's fairly obvious. I mean, the fact that Muslims honor Jesus as a great prophet, that Mary is mentioned more in the Quran than Mary is mentioned in the New Testament. That I remember one of my good friends, who was a Muslim leader, said during one of the rough times, in terms of what was going on in America, he said, I'm in an unfair situation. He said, my kids are named Isa and Musa, and so I can't get back at those that say terrible things about the Prophet Muhammad by saying terrible things about Jesus, or about Moses, and I remember that there's a fellow who wrote a book quite a few years ago that really worked on this, a scholar of Middle East, and I got to write the foreword, and I really liked that, that this was a book that emphasized, the Judeo-Christian Islamic, tradition, and being aware of that and being open to it, is important. And if you really get honest about it, for a lot of people who are good believers, they're busy with their life, and they're busy, and they want to learn about their faith. They don't have time, or to be developing this, if you will, more comparative perspective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and this is something I'm constantly trying to remind myself as well, to be more tolerant towards difference of opinion. And I think as Muslims, we tend to be more intolerant toward other Muslims. When it comes to non-Muslims, we're okay to hear anything, we don't mind. But when it comes to other Muslims, the slightest thing just kind of puts us off, to the point where if you keep doing that, you're going to be on your own. Basically, it's a religion of one then. Um, and I think that is something maybe that's getting a little bit more worse, while it should be getting better, because we're interacting with Muslims from all parts of the world more easily now than we ever were before. But I completely agree. I think that is a problem. I have a question for you that I think you've probably been asked many times before, but I have no idea if you find it amusing or irritating. And if it's the latter, I really apologize in advance. You spend so much time studying Islam. Why are you not a Muslim?
Yes, I was going to say, I know what the question's going to be. Um, when
I'm sure Muslims and non-Muslims all want to know.
when I first went to Malaysia, they asked me to speak, and I was just a grad student. I was still working on my dissertation, and there was almost nobody there. And then by the end of the week, we had a packed auditorium, And the question that would come up all the time, no matter what I was talking about, and it'd be done respectfully. Somebody would raise their hand and say, I don't understand how you can understand Islam so well and not be a Muslim. Um, I I sort of am uh, um, who I am. I mean, um, I I like Sarah Joseph, who's a good friend, in something that she wrote. Um, talked about. She was talking about diversity, I think, and she talked about people who were a Muslim with a small m, with a small m. Um, and so sometimes when I get that question, I'll put it, that way. I think that I see myself as primarily um, a scholar of Islam, um, but I also um, don't see a contradiction between being a scholar of Islam and having a very strong appreciation for um, um, the faith of Islam, both in terms of seeing, a lot of comparative, examples or comparisons, but even where there are differences. I don't. I think um, I like the idea in some ways, more so in the past because it was more uh, uh, in the old days. There weren't that many scholars of Islam, first of all, because there weren't that many jobs. Um, but I felt that I was happy that I could play a role, or that somebody would um, uh, really connect, as it were, with me. Um, and uh, that said something to me. The fact that believers, would really be able to to connect and see that I did understand in a way that before they would just say, well, you 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 can't have understood unless you do, and uh, in fact, I remember that first trip to Malaysia. By the last session, which was packed, a young Malay came back who had studied in Britain and the United States. Brilliant young guy, and they loved my last talk was on Islam in the West. Of course, they loved the first part, and then he said to me, "But when you got to the second part, it really showed, the influence of your non-Muslim teachers." And I said, "I got you." And he looked at me. I said, my mentor was Ismail Al-Faruqi. I only studied with Muslims. And we became great friends, and even I'd have a great career. But I think that more and more, um, this is true for many faiths. I've had some exposure, not a lot, but experience, with Buddhism, and for example, you talk about Buddhist meditation, etc. And you know, but yeah, no, I mean, I spent, what, from the age of, let's see, I must have been about 27 when I first, to my age now, which I will not reveal. But, but I've spent my lifetime. In fact, I'm supposed to be writing a memoir, and for Oxford University Press, and we didn't have a title, and I couldn't think of one, so it was uh, uh, something like my life, no, in Islam and with Muslims, or something along those lines. And then I noticed that a book that was published years ago that I did not like, and it was published in Britain. It was called Among the Believers, and I didn't like what the person, he went out and among the scholars, a very famous writer, and I didn't like that, but I like the title, and the book is now out of print. So if I ever do finish my book, I probably would want to say Among the Believers, and then it'd still be, when you think about it, some people will be saying, aha, he's come out of the closet. You know, I mean, one critic of mine said it so at a certain point, I don't know whether he's a Muslim or not. That was the way of putting it down, but it certainly sounds like he is, rather than dealing with the fact that he didn't like, you know,
Yeah.
what I said. Yeah. Yeah.
Very good
It's,
point, I think. I think I had those problems as well, not with anything you said, but in the past when I first started reading Karen Armstrong, I just couldn't
mm,
understand why this lady, knowing so much about Islam, is not a Muslim. It took me a long time to understand that. Now, kind of, I understand these things, but it's still an interesting question for me, and I'm sure for other people.
this is going to
Also,
be edited, right? This will be edited. This
sorry.
is going to be, this is going to
Yes,
be
yes,
edited.
yes,
Okay. So now I'll tell you something
yes.
where I address this issue. At a certain point, I was invited to a meeting in a Gulf state that had American and British uh, uh, government people, also Muslims and non-Muslims. It was a very relatively small meeting, and John Kerry was one of the speakers there, etc. And then I did a talk, and then we had the last panel, and in the last panel I was the last speaker. Okay, one of the things you learn as a public speaker, okay, is no matter how you feel about it, you go to the men's room before you go on stage. Okay. Especially if it's going to be, you don't know how long it's going to be.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't. I got on stage and I thought everybody was going to be brief. And then it got to somebody, if I mentioned his name, you would know him. And he went on and on. And I thought, this is the agony and ecstasy of my life here. So when he finished, I said, well, I've already given a talk and you've heard everybody else, so I'm going to be brief. And I said, I decided I would, this is a closed session. It's all off the record. Of course, I don't believe in off the record because people never live
Yeah.
up to it. I said, but I feel I can now address this question. I said, there's been an issue about my identity for quite a few years. And I'm going to address it. I said, it's difficult for me, but this is the first time, and I hope we can keep it in the room. And so I sort of went down like this and thought for a while. And I said, I just really want to be honest with you. Okay. I'm going to really be honest. And I went, I do dye my hair. Okay. After it, first of all, the Europeans looked at me like, what is this? But after it, the younger Muslims came and said, the older guys were all saying, mashallah, mashallah, mashallah. You really disappointed them, And I didn't do that to make a sort of joke about it, but it's like, how do you answer? How do you answer? To me, the greatest compliment that I've ever gotten is, I always take it as a great compliment when somebody says something about, this is a big thing, it's one thing to be a scholar of something. It's another thing to be the scholar that people can sometimes disagree or whatever, but that people will feel that you've gotten inside, that and I don't think that would have ever happened if it weren't that it was with Ismail and with all the Muslim students in class, and because Islam came alive when we got discussions, and the diversity of Islam, and for example, when we discussed hadith, you would have a Muslim would say, when talking about the Prophet, he would say, well, we know this about the Prophet, and he'd lay it out, and I was just, and it was during Ramadan, and Ismail's wife, who was also a scholar, was passing out dates. I had a date in my mouth, and one of the Muslims said, we know how the Prophet brushed his teeth. We know how the Prophet did this, and we know how the Prophet would also, when he did it in a delicate way, sleeping with his wife, what side he would be on. And when he said that, I was so shocked, I bit on the
You are
pin.
shocked.
I didn't realize it had a pin. And I was in agony. But in Ismail's class, you didn't sort of say, excuse me, I have to leave the room. But in other words, it was that time when you would see it coming alive, or when the first exam that we had, somebody who went on to be a very prominent in Jamaati Islami in Pakistan asked to borrow my book. And we were talking, and 3 times he said, I'll get it back to you Tuesday, inshallah. And I finally said, I'm new at this. The third inshallah really got to me. are you really going to get the book to me on time? So years later, a woman picked me up to take me into northern UK to give lectures, and she pulls up, and she's wearing the cob. We're in this big BMW. I'm in the back, and I brought up this example, and she said she immediately came alive. She said, "That's my husband." I ask him to do something, and he says, "Inshallah," and I say, "Is this inshallah? You're going to do it, or you're not going to do it?" So we connected on that.
Yeah, it's so true. It is like a joke, running joke in Muslim countries that when you don't want to do something, you just say inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah.
But thank you so much. That was really interesting to know. Also, the thing that you mentioned about how you've been taught by Islamic scholars, I think that's amazing. I was just sitting thinking here, it must be such a nice experience to be your student in your classroom. I'm sure those students would be so lucky, and they're going to go on to become really um, valuable members of society. Um, I think it is important to learn from people in that kind of way if you can. It kind of reminds me, my father-in-law, an English gentleman, he quite often coming to me saying, haha, I read this about Islam, that it was like something about, can't remember the author, but basically just negative things. And then I'd explain, and then they'd come up with another negative thing, and then another one. And we'd be talking about it. And I said, Chris, all of that is fine. I think it's good to read about these things from all sorts of sources and to try and understand them. But the thing is, you've never once read a Muslim text to see what the Muslims are trying to say about the thing. And that's
Mm.
kind of like me trying to find out about you and asking all your neighbors, the shopkeeper, everyone, and just not coming and talking to you and then making an opinion about you.
Mm, mm.
And so he was saying, yeah, that's a good point. But I think that is really, really good. And it shows that you've had that opportunity. So yeah, that's lovely.
No, I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I was going to say in closing that I've heard if you like a book, never meet the author of the book because you're going to be disappointed. But this was complete the opposite of that. It was an absolute pleasure, and inshallah we'll do it again one day soon.
Sure, sure. I really enjoyed it.